feels better. Good to be back among you. As I said, it's very fortuitous to have the Emperor's new clothes read just before elections. Each time I hear that story, the relevance of it for our life, not just children, but all of us, is so, so powerful. There have been many times my wife and I've been teaching at Ripon for 27 years, and there have been many times when my wife looks at me and she says, somebody should tell that dean or president he's got new clothes. Who's going to do it? It's hard. Constructive criticism. An oxymoron? You know, an oxymoron is putting two words or phrases together that are really opposites when they stand alone, and they normally are not associated. But sometimes they make sense when you put them together if there's an explanation. Webster's dictionary defines an oxymoron as a figure of speech in which opposite or contradictory ideas or terms are combined, or a smart saying, which at first view appears foolish. Now, the word comes from two Greek words, oxys, which means sharp, and moros, which means dull or foolish. Our word moron comes from the same moros, dull or foolish. Now, some Yogi Berra-isms could be considered oxymorons, like, it's getting late early, or nobody goes there anymore because it's too crowded. Or his big one, it's deja vu all over again. He's got a million. Now, some oxymorons are more serious in tone than yogis, and constructive criticism could be considered one of those. Some would say it is really not possible to resolve the tension between these two words, because this is not a smart saying which at first view appears foolish. It is just plain foolish, since it's impossible, many people say, to accomplish anything positive with a negative remark. Criticism, to most people, has a negative connotation. In class, when we begin to study scripture, and I want to introduce biblical criticism, I ask the students, what does the word criticism mean to you? And of course, they all say, well, that's negative stuff, that's running people down. Whereas constructive means something positive, building up, encouraging. I think American politics today is full of criticisms of opponents that not only tear down, but are really vicious. Just think of the 30-second commercials that we're bombarded with now as the election approaches. Millions of dollars are being spent on negative ads. Unfortunately, what we've been told is the research shows that negative ads are effective because they appeal to very base emotions, fear, anger, hatred, and that these move people to action more than positive messages. Very sad. In schools, for the past generation, there has been a move going in the other direction. Some educational psychologists believe that young egos are very fragile, and because they are, building self-esteem in the classroom is essential. Always give positive feedback to students, this school of thought argues. I had a colleague at Ripon College who is now retired, who told me many years ago that when grading papers, he always wrote comments in pencil so as not to make students feel bad. He said ink is too permanent and jarring and scary, whereas pencil can be erased. Today, one has to be very careful what one says, even if they are giving professional advice for which they're trained. People sometimes feel they know more than doctors, and they tell them they want a certain drug or procedure they've seen on television or heard about, even if the doctor's professional judgment indicates otherwise. My son is a doctor, and he gets this a lot. Malpractice suits are sometimes threatened if the doctor does not comply with the unwise demand of the patient. Religious traditions teach not to judge others lest we be judged, and to always be kind to others. Criticizing them would be a violation of the principle, if you do not have something nice to say to others, say nothing at all. We've all heard that saying since we've been kids, or variations of it. Now, these kinds of reactions to the phrase constructive criticism in politics, education, medicine, law, and religion sometimes really hamper the possibility of hearing and telling the truth to others, even if they need to hear it. Now, there are three common ways that I think people react when they see something wrong. There are probably many, but here are three common ones. Sometimes when we see something being done wrong, either to another person or ourselves, we remain silent and we turn our backs or just suck it up. People are often afraid of offending others or losing a relationship with them. Many abused women or children are terrified of being alone or being abused worse if they speak up and tell the abuser to stop. In less serious cases, sometimes people just don't want to be bothered in telling another person they're doing wrong to stop, because the conversation might not go well, and it might take a lot of time to work this through. Besides, we often say to ourselves, it's not my problem. Fear and cowardice produce silence, and the wrongdoer continues in the pattern of destructive behavior. Now, a second common response is this. We feel we should take some action. So we complain behind the back of the wrongdoer to a third party who can do nothing about it. Sometimes when we see a wrong done by another person in our lives, it does bother us. And we feel we should get it off our chest. But rather than confront the wrongdoer, we go to someone else and we gossip. Usually the person we talk to can't do anything about the wrong, but we feel a little better and safer unloading on them rather than speaking to the person doing wrong. We're much less likely to be told we might be wrong or mind our own business, and this alternative is more attractive, but it's certainly not effective in changing the behavior of the one doing the wrong. Now, the third thing sometimes is we let this discomfort build up within us. We suck it up. And then finally we explode in anger at the wrongdoer. When we just can't walk away or find a third party to complain to anymore, but we feel deeply the wrong being done either to ourselves or someone else, we suppress the anger as best we can for a long time, hoping things will change. But then when they don't, eventually we let it out, sometimes unexpectedly. It just explodes in the face of the offending party. We just cannot put up with it any longer, and the volcano in us erupts towards the wrongdoer, condemning them with verbal abuse. Very often the wrongdoer is shocked and offended, goes on the defensive, hurls harsh words back to us, denies their responsibility for their negative action, and sometimes just walks away. Now, these three reactions, although understandable and very human, do little to improve the situation. They are all too often the only option that people feel they have when experiencing a hurt or injustice being done. And yet, we all know that consequences by taking one of these three alternatives are not constructive. We've lost the ability in American politics to disagree respectfully. And so we get dishonest or vicious leaders. Corporations spin the truth about products to make money. And only in the fine print or at the end of the commercial, very rapidly, do they tell you the negative side effects. We bend over backwards not to offend friends or family, even when there is blatant wrongdoing. We sometimes coddle young people with a false sense of self-esteem by not teaching them to take responsibility for their actions. We prefer to sue professionals for not doing what we want, but which is against their professional judgment. And we prefer to remain silent sometimes in marriages, partnerships, or friendships, since we find it too hard to speak candidly to one another. and thus we risk the future soundness of the relationship by being silent. Effective truth-telling is one of the hardest things to do in American culture today, but it's taking a serious toll on our peace of mind, our personal relationships, and on our culture as a whole when we don't do it. Now, the world religions not only teach the golden rule, but they also teach being honest. The root word of the Greek word krino, which is the root word of our word criticize, means to judge, assess, and decide. It is not a negative word. It does not, in its origins, have any negative connotations. They've come later in secondary meanings over time as the term has been transmitted to other cultures and languages beyond its Greek origin. So today, the term used by scholars in searching for the original meaning of biblical texts is called biblical criticism. That's why I ask my students when we begin the study of texts, we're going to read about biblical criticism, what do they think the word means? And of course, most of them say, well, that's negative. But scholars do not mean that as a negative term, because biblical criticism means making wise judgments based on accurate information as to what the text says in its original context. Although all world religions teach that it's essential to respect others, since a piece of the divine or sacred is in everyone, none of them teach to duck the responsibility of telling the truth in face of wrongdoing. They all call for making wise judgments and being responsible to offer these judgments to others when we believe they're harming themselves or us or someone else. In Judaism, the tradition of the prophets emerged at the time after David and Solomon, about 800 years before Jesus, to remind the people that they were straying from the commandments by worshiping false gods and exploiting the poor by stealing from them, by false pricing or by low wages. The 12 major and minor prophets arose and spoke out publicly against these violations. They told it like it was. They called to accountability Jewish leaders, especially priests, kings, and landowners, and commercial agents who were betraying the covenant their ancestors made with God, which was seriously hurting themselves morally and others physically. Now, several of these prophets were at first very reluctant to denounce publicly idolatry and social injustice, since it got them into deep trouble with those in power. They knew they could be persecuted or even in some cases put to death, and that's what happened to many of them. But in their preaching and writing, they acknowledged that God would not let them off the hook if they remained silent. They would share in the punishment of evildoers if they shirked their responsibility to tell the truth. Now that came out very much in the first reading that John did. The prophet Ezekiel doesn't want to go out, make a fool of himself, make enemies, but God is calling him to denounce injustice. And God says to him, if you do not speak to warn the wicked to turn from their ways, the wicked shall die in their iniquity, but their blood I will require at your hand. You are your sisters and brothers' keeper, whether you like it or not. You share in their sin if you do nothing to try to stop it. That's the prophetic tradition in the Bible. Pretty strong words. Without the courage and persistence of prophets like Ezekiel and others in the Jewish tradition, the denunciations of Jesus against the religious and political corruption of his time would not have had any credibility. He was standing on the shoulders of giants. Later prophets in Christian history like Martin Luther King Jr. and Martin Luther himself, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, would never have made it beyond their front doors had it not been for the inspiration of these Jewish prophets of old. None of these prophets, however, were driven primarily by anger. They were motivated mainly by love. Time and again, their words were filled with reminders of how much religious and political leaders, even when they were doing wrong, how much they meant to God and to the community they served. They sometimes use angry words, but always judiciously and focused on the context of the moment, never as a normal pattern of telling the truth to others. Just anger, tough love, does have its timely place in confronting wrongs. But biblically, it is always rooted in a deeper respect for the wrongdoer, which is conveyed in the whole message of the prophets. Their criticism was always constructive, not destructive. Now, Jesus was no slouch himself in expressing public anger at the hypocrisy of the religious leaders of his day. However, he also taught that public bluntness is not the best policy to correct wrongdoing in close personal relationships. His words this morning that we heard from Matthew chapter 18 offers a different approach for face-to-face relationships. He says, go to your brother or sister and talk to them privately. Take a few others to talk with them if the first conversation hasn't worked. Only as a last resort are you to refer to the higher authorities in the community to take disciplinary action against the offender. Jesus well knew the danger of silence in the face of wrongdoing in close relationships, or gossip, or tattling to others, or explosive public anger against someone who means a lot to us. Sit down, speak the truth calmly to another in a way they can hear it. This is the most constructive way for families, lovers, friends, and communities to operate if they sincerely want to help another person who's doing wrong, not just make themselves feel good by getting it off their chest. Now, in Buddhism, the third step in the eightfold path to enlightenment, Buddha says, speak the truth with kindness. The Dalai Lama, as we heard this morning, explains how to do this. He says, if a person speaks coldly or harshly, we feel uneasy and wish for a quick end to the interaction. From the least to the most important event, the affection and respect of others are vital for our happiness, he says. He also advises, in that last reading, that before we speak, we try to put ourselves in another person's situation. His words are very wise. He says the technique involves the capacity to temporarily suspend insisting on your own viewpoint, but rather look from the other person's perspective. To imagine what would be the situation if you were in his or her shoes, how would you deal with this? This helps you develop an awareness and respect for another person's feelings, which is an important factor in reducing conflicts and problems with other people. Buddhists also teach that when we practice this kind of honest but kind speech to others, we might learn something ourselves. In the event that our judgment about the behavior of others is actually wrong, which could be the case, speaking in such a tone gives them the opportunity to explain themselves if we have made a mistake in judging them. They offer us the possibility, as the Native Americans say, walk a mile in their moccasins. And when you do, you will understand them much better. There's a lot of wisdom in the Native American tradition and in Buddhism about this. These spiritual traditions have survived for centuries because there is profound and perennial wisdom they convey. Not just to reach a life after death, but to live a meaningful life here in this world with each other, justly, peacefully, and lovingly. So, constructive criticism can be seen as a true oxymoron, a smart saying which at first appears foolish, but on second view, when examined thoughtfully, is quite practical and can go a long way to clear the air, help others improve their behavior, get at the truth, and strengthen relationships. If practiced the way Ezekiel, Jesus, and the Dalai Lama advise, it produces the possibilities for a more just and harmonious society. Our Jewish brothers and sisters recently celebrated Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It is the one day of the year when Jews fast and spend the day in reflection, prayer, and sorrow for their sins of the past year. Many Jews on that day also take the opportunity to communicate in letter, phone, email, face-to-face conversation with others whom they may have offended during the past year. They realized that part of the responsibility to tell the truth involves telling the truth to others when we have hurt them and ask for their pardon. The Jews believe all constructive criticism begins with ourselves. It's a wonderful, beautiful, and constructive way to repair relationships. To do what Jews call tikkun olam, the two Hebrew words, which mean repairing the world, restoring a broken order of justice. One tikkun olam involves seeking pardon by telling another person we are sorry for what we did to them, or having made a breach in a relationship based on our own foolishness for having done an injustice to them. I think we could all learn from these wisdom traditions about the importance of practicing the oxymoron constructive criticism in our lives, including telling the truth to others when they need to hear it, and asking pardon when we have offended them. Rabbi David Bruson of Milwaukee, who teaches at Ripon College, tells me that on Yom Kippur, he gets on the phone and he calls people to apologize for any hurts he has caused them during the past year, knowingly or unknowingly. He said it's a very powerful day for him. I got on the phone around Yom Kippur myself to do some tikkun olam with those whom I recently hurt by breaking the order of trust between us with some unkind words. They responded graciously and lovingly. The breach was repaired. Tikkun olam was accomplished. Let us all practice that when we can. Shalom.